You know that the planet is facing unprecedented loss of biodiversity, severely undermining the ecosystem services upon which depend for human health, well-being, and economic development. Since 1970, the world has lost 60% of its vertebrate population. Natural wetlands have declined by 35%, and coral reefs are under extreme threat and are projected to decline by 90% under a 2 degrees Celsius warming. It is not too late to halt and reverse these trends. The population of plants and animals can increase again if we restore their habitat and avoid polluting it. The current set of Aichi targets under the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, expires next year. So we are now in a crucial time in the lead up to 15th Conference of the Parties to the CBD, taking place in late 2020 in Kunming, China, where the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is to be agreed. To support this process, the OECD is working on a project called the Post-2020 Biodiversity Framework Targets, Indicators, and Measurability Implications at global and national level. As part of this work, the OECD recently convened an international expert workshop on February 26 this year to bring together policymakers, scientists, and leading experts to share and exchange views and ideas on how to design a post-2020 global framework that is more specific and measurable. Katya Kurosaki, who has been leading our work on biodiversity, land use, and ecosystems for many years now, will present some of the insights from this ongoing work and the key messages from the recent OECD workshop. There will be roughly half an hour for questions. For those of you online today, you can send questions at any time during the talk to questions moderator. The question moderator today is Beth. In the chat section of your WebEx screen, and I will convey them to Katya. This is your chance to dig deeper in this subject. So without any further ado, Katya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rodolfo, for that introduction. And I'm going to go ahead and get straight into the work that we're currently undertaking to support the process towards COP15 in China. And just to start off with a little bit of international context, as many of us probably know already, the current strategic plan for biodiversity, which runs from 2011 to 2020, and within that, the Aichi biodiversity targets are due to expire very soon, next year. In this context, the COP15, the CBD conference of the 15th Conference of the Parties, which will take place in Kunming in China, is a vital opportunity to reflect upon what are the lessons learned from the Aichi biodiversity targets and how we can design a clearer, more effective, more rigorous post-2020 global biodiversity framework that can catalyze both international and national action. Rodolfo has explained that the current trends on biodiversity loss are very, very dire, and that now really is the time to act. Within this framework, there's a very large international process currently underway, specifically as a result of CBD COP14, which took place in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Agreement was reached to establish a new process called the Open-Ended Working Group on the Post-2020 Biodiversity Framework. Right now, a series of workshops, regional consultation workshops, are being organized and underway to bring regional countries together to discuss their views, share ideas on how to better design an effective post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So there was recently a meeting in Japan, then more recently in Germany, and there will be several more. After which, as of late sort of the fall of this year, there will be international meetings on through the Open-Ended Working Group for the Post-2020 Biodiversity Framework, and a step-by-step progress process to tackle different issues. Many of you might also be aware of, we've just culminated with the IPBES global assessment and the meeting that took place here in Paris, hosted by UNESCO. They've launched their report on May 6th, received a lot of headlines. Also, under the French G7 presidency, there was the G7 Environment Ministers meeting that just took place this week on 5 to 6 of May, where they talked about both climate change and biodiversity. So that was a very successful meeting. And in that regard, also France had asked us to prepare a report on biodiversity, finance, and the economic and business case for action, which we also released at the G7 Environment Ministers meeting on the 6th of May. And I'll speak a little bit more to that in a moment afterwards. But let me tell you more about our current project, which, as Rodolfo mentioned, is on the post-2020 biodiversity framework, targets, indicators, and measurability implications at global and national level. The objectives of this work is first to share lessons from the existing Aichi biodiversity targets. So what were some of the successes and weaknesses and how we can build upon that for a more effective post-2020 framework. To consider options to improve the structure and measurability of the post-2020 global targets, and also how to better understand how the data that's available today at multi-country level can be used to help inform the development of targets. So we prepared a background paper for an international expert workshop that we convened. The background paper was organized as follows, as you can see here on the slides, provided some international context, principles, criteria, and concepts. So sort of back to the basics in terms of what is the theory of how to design effective environmental targets and indicators. Also looking, of course, at the Aichi biodiversity targets and the current set of indicators that we have to monitor progress towards each of the Aichi biodiversity targets. And then finally, recent developments and proposals that have been put forward, including from different NGOs and a proposal from the OECD that I will speak about in a moment. So the background paper and the workshop was prepared by myself and also my colleague Will Symes, who's sitting next to Rodolfo here on the left. And of course, I'd also very much like to thank the European Commission for the support that they provided for the workshop and for the project as it continues. So just to highlight here, for further information as well, this is the workshop website that we have prepared, which includes the summary record, excerpts from the background paper that we prepared, the agenda, presentations, and participants list. And just to highlight that we had more than 70 participants at this international expert workshop. We brought together policymakers, experts from intergovernmental organizations, from non-governmental organizations, leading scientists. Countries that were present included OECD countries, Egypt, Costa Rica, Indonesia. We had representation from the Convention on Biological Diversity. We were very pleased to also have a co-chair from the Open-Ended Working Group on the Post-2020 Framework, Francis Ogbal, BirdLife International, IUCN. So we had a really excellent group of people there to share their views on these different aspects of the post-2020 framework. Just to provide a little bit more context in terms of concepts and criteria and principles, as you may know, the way that, generally speaking, that environmental targets and indicators are set are through the pressure state response framework, where the state reflects the state of biodiversity, for example, the conditions that are there, whether it's quantity, quality of the environment across numerous different types of indicators, the pressures that are exerted on biodiversity in this case, whether it's land use change, climate change, invasive alien species, etc. And then also the responses. The responses are the actions that governments, the private sector, civil society puts in place to address the pressures and then hopefully achieve results in terms of the state. What we've added here as well is building on the literature on the theory of change. When you look at the types of actions and responses that can be put in place, these cover inputs, processes, outputs, outcomes, and then impacts. So inputs are, for example, finance that's being put in place to address an environmental challenge, processes such as interministerial committees to improve the governance, outputs and outcomes. And in theory, ideally, if these are effectively put in place, they will result in impacts on biodiversity. And these impacts in this last stage means that if they've been effective, that they will improve the state of biodiversity as well. So just to get into a little bit more detail in terms of what these inputs, processes, outputs, outcomes, and impacts entail, here we have in the middle column the definitions of these examples, and then on the other side, specific examples as they relate to biodiversity. So an input, as I mentioned, can be the budget allocated to biodiversity, the number of staff that's in place, for example, in protected areas to help enforce and manage them more effectively. Processes, as I mentioned, is an example of an interministerial committee for biodiversity to help ensure that there's more coherence across different sectors in the way that they try to address the pressures on biodiversity. Then outputs, such as the introduction of new policy instruments, new studies, such as national ecosystem assessments, etc. Outcomes refer to things like the reduction of pesticide use, or when protected areas, the coverage of protected areas actually increases. And finally, the impacts, which I mentioned also reflects then upon the state, is when you have improved condition of biodiversity and sustainability of ecosystem services, of threatened species, etc. So turning more closely to some of the lessons learned from the 2011-2020 Aichi biodiversity targets. One thing very important was there was a massive improvement in the current framework compared to the one that was before that, before 2010. So currently the Aichi biodiversity targets, there are 20 of them. They cover both pressures, state, and responses, cover different sectors: agriculture, forestry, fisheries, national development planning. They're a very, very comprehensive set of targets. In terms of some of the weaknesses that are currently inherent in the Aichi biodiversity targets, many are recognizing that there is linguistic ambiguity with regard to the targets themselves, that it's been quite difficult to track progress in a way that is consistent and comparable across countries, and I'll get to that again in a moment. And also that the suite of indicators that has been set up through the indicative list under the Convention on Biological Diversity, which I will also get to in a moment, there has not been much uptake of those indicators at the national level. So what now many countries all around the world are calling for is smarter targets together with associated indicators. And the smarter targets here, the S refers to specific, M is measurable, so measurable targets, ambitious targets, realistic targets, and also time-bound targets. And I would also just like to emphasize here that what we're focusing on in our project is only the specific and the measurable. We're not looking at the level of ambition. It's really to provide technical support, which can then be used by countries as they so wish. Another call that is quite unanimous across all parties is that the targets and the indicators for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework should be developed in a more iterative way and in a parallel way. One of the things that had sort of evolved in the development of the 2011-2020 Aichi biodiversity targets is that the parties had agreed on the 20 Aichi targets in 2010, but it was only years later, 2014 or 2015, that the set of indicators had been agreed upon, the indicative list of indicators. So a lot of time had been sort of lost between 2010 and several years later, when agreement yet hadn't been reached on how are we going to monitor progress towards these targets. And so one of the lessons learned is that to the greatest extent possible now in Kunming in China in 2020, that these targets and the indicators should be developed in a parallel manner so that we know from the get-go, okay, this is what we plan to do, and this is how we're going to monitor progress towards these targets. One of the things that we did in our analysis in this background paper is we looked across all of the 20 Aichi targets and examined whether they were a pressure target, a state target, or a response target. Some of the Aichi biodiversity targets cover multiple elements, as you can see here under the column on pressure, state, response. Then we also categorized the response variables, so the actions that are being put in place, in terms of whether they refer to processes, to outputs, to inputs, etc. So we have these listed here for the response targets and indicators. And then also indicated on the very end of the table whether each of these targets were quantified or quantitatively specific. And you see here that very few of the Aichi targets are quantified. One very well-known example of where they are quantitatively specific is on Aichi target 11, which is on protected areas, where we have a target of 10% for marine areas and 17% for terrestrial land of protected areas. And this is actually one of the few targets that we're on track to meet by 2020. But across many of the other targets, the language is more ambiguous. It talks about encouraging positive incentives or the need to integrate into national development planning, but it's more difficult to monitor that in a quantitatively specific way. So, and just to illustrate this, if you look here, this is how the Global Biodiversity Outlook 4, released in 2014, has tracked or evaluated progress towards each of the biodiversity targets. So you see here, each of the targets is 1, 2, 3, 4 through 20. And based on their analysis, you see the red, green, which is good. It means we're on track to meet that specific Aichi target. Red means no significant progress, and for some of them we even see worse. We're doing worse than we were before. So you see, this is a sort of the traffic light system: red, yellow, green, and purple in the case of even worse decline. So it's a qualitative way of evaluating how we're doing towards each of the targets. Similarly here, this was from a presentation given at the Regional Consultation Workshop on the Post-2020 Biodiversity Framework just now in January 2019. You have each of the targets aligned from the top to the bottom, but this is based on the 191 reports that were provided to the CBD Secretariat that each of the countries provided, the 191 countries, so from their 5th national reports. And you see here the gray refers to lack of information from a certain number of countries across a certain number of targets. The purple is moving away from a target. No progress is red. etc. We have green, but as we can see here, not very much green, and on track is the blue. So in terms of the indicators, just to come back to what I had mentioned before, what we have now under the Convention on Biological Diversity is under Decision 28. There are 98 indicative indicators that have been provided to encourage parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity to use these indicators when reporting on their progress towards the HE targets, of which at that point in time 35 were highlighted as having potential for disaggregation at the national level. And also there is the efforts under the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership, which is also under the Convention on Biological Diversity, where they currently have 64 indicators to monitor progress towards the Aichi targets, a number of which have been highlighted as being applicable at the national level, although not all of these are applicable at the national level today. So it highlights there's potential to have the data also tracked at national level for each of the countries, but not quite the case yet. And as I mentioned before, a lot of these 98 indicators and the 64 indicators, when you look at national level reporting, the uptake of these indicators is quite low still. So one of the things that we've proposed in our current ongoing work is the possibility of introducing categories of indicators for the post-2020 biodiversity framework, including a set of headline indicators. And what this refers to is it's an approach that has been used also in our OECD Green Growth Indicator framework, where currently under the Green Growth Indicator framework, there are around 50 indicators being used to monitor progress against green growth. But within those 50 indicators, there's a much smaller set of headline indicators where the headline indicators must be consistent and comparable across countries, so that the same data is being used across all the countries, so that you can monitor also at the national level, but you can also aggregate these and provide a total estimate, if you like, at the global level. So what we proposed is the idea of quantified headline indicators to cover both the pressure, the state, and the responses, so the actions. For example, up to maybe 30 or 40 indicators, using data that is available in a consistent and comparable way across countries. And then obviously like a larger set of indicators building on the ones that we already have, further developments, of course, as we progress into the next stages of the development of the post-2020 framework. Yes, and then also possibly another suite of indicators for the so-called enabling conditions. The reason that we've added this third category of enabling conditions was to align with a proposal that had been put forward by an NGO group that had a structure of state and actions, where the third category was also enabling conditions. These enabling conditions are things like raising public awareness, which is also reflected in the HE targets, the need to raise communication to reach out to the public, the establishment of national biodiversity strategies and action plans, good governance, etc. So based on the discussions at the workshop, we had various breakout groups to try and identify what are really the most important targets in a post-2020 framework that we really would like to monitor progress towards in a consistent and comparable way across countries. So this is just a repeat from a previous slide, but based on what really might be the most important targets to measure across pressure, state, and responses, and what types of indicators are available today or might be available in the very short time frame so that we could create maybe a smaller set of these headline indicators to prioritize national efforts from international organizations to, as quickly as possible, develop the smaller set of headline indicators so that we can monitor progress in a more consistent and comparable way. And these just highlight here some examples of possible headline indicators that we had discussed at the workshop based on different breakout groups, experts, etc. So pressures could include land cover change, which is measured in a consistent and comparable way across countries, deforestation, pesticide use or sales per hectare. In terms of state, where we do have quite some data on that is comparable and consistent, things like threatened species, wetland extent trends index. And then finally, in terms of responses, data on Aichi Target 3 indicators, such as positive incentives, which is one of the indicators that the OECD is also tracking now on instruments such as biodiversity relevant taxes, biodiversity relevant fees and charges, positive incentives for biodiversity, tradable permits that governments are putting in place that are also relevant to biodiversity, which are measured in a comparable way across each of the countries. Another response outcome variable that we already have today, this is just to illustrate an example, is the protected area coverage, where we do have consistent comparable data. And then another one is finance, that is being promoted, put forward to help conserve and sustainably use and restore biodiversity. So in terms of some of the key messages from our workshop that we had here, there was general consensus that the Aichi biodiversity targets are relatively complicated, that the language is often ambiguous, and there was a call overall for greater simplicity in the post-2020 framework, so clearer targets, more measurable targets. That the post-20 targets and indicators should build on the current framework. I mean, we've come a very long way, but there is further to go. So we should build on the current framework, building on areas of success, and also that the targets and indicators should be developed in parallel in an iterative manner. There was general agreement that the NGO proposal on the pyramid approach, which highlighted the different possible elements of the post-2020 framework, is complementary to introducing potential categories of indicators, as we put forth in our background paper. Finally, also that many multi-country data sets already exist covering pressure, state, and response indicators, much more so than existed, say, 10 years ago, that would enable the monitoring of progress towards any targets in a comparable way. And general strong emphasis on the need for further analysis on indicators for the post-2020 framework. Several delegates and participants stated that really indicators is the cornerstone of the post-2020 biodiversity framework, and that we need to invest a lot more time on this issue. And in particular also on targets and indicators for mainstreaming biodiversity. So how to integrate biodiversity across different sectors, agriculture, energy, fishing, etc., to make sure that we're addressing the pressures that are also stemming from different sources of policy, as do, of course, the enabling conditions. So that is our website for the workshop if you'd like to learn more. We are continuing to work on this project and will be doing further analysis on the types of multi-country data sets that are available. We will be working also in an iterative manner as the negotiations and the processes currently evolve in the international setting, when countries are putting forward new suggestions for potential targets in the post-2020 framework. We'll be analyzing what indicator suites are available to address those targets in a more specific manner. We look forward to inputs and questions from a very, very broad range of stakeholders. So thank you very much. I'm just going to stop here, highlighting some of our other recent work. As we mentioned in the very beginning, we've just released a report this week on that we prepared for the G7 meeting in Metz, Biodiversity, Finance, and the Economic and Business Case for Action. So please visit our website if you'd like to learn more. There's also the brochure that we released for Egypt for COP14, which is on tracking economic instruments and finance for biodiversity, which relates to Aichi Target 3. And then other work on mainstreaming biodiversity for sustainable development, and a little bit earlier on the political economy of biodiversity policy reform, which looks at issues such as competitiveness, distributional issues, and how these issues can be addressed when aiming to design effective biodiversity policies that are also ambitious. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Katia. Thank you very much, Katia. Now we will open the floor for questions. And I'm going to start with the persons that are in the room. Do you have some questions? Because we always receive questions from the audience. But please, introduce yourself and make the question, please.
Thank you, Katia. My name's Hannah Leckie in the Environment Directorate. I kind of have a three-part question. So how do we ensure that targets are not only achieved, like for terrestrial or marine protected areas, but achieved in the right places? And related to that, how much of a barrier is issues around land rights and the rights to marine areas? And then lastly, how do we get the climate community and through all their actions for climate mitigation to also think about biodiversity targets and biodiversity benefits, and not just go and plant 1 trillion trees without being strategic about which species to plant and in which locations to maximize co-benefits for biodiversity?
Thank you very much, Hannah, for those three questions. In terms of how to achieve protected areas, both terrestrial and marine protected areas in the right places, we've done some analysis on that. We released a publication last year, specifically on marine protected areas, but the principles apply also to terrestrial protected areas. And one of the things that we recommended is that when you're looking in terms of where to locate your, say in this case, your marine protected area, you should really start off by targeting where are the areas with the highest biodiversity benefits. So the most vibrant, most valuable, the ones with the highest that are providing the highest ecosystem services. Then if you need to go through a selection process because you might not have enough resources, for example, to target all those areas at the same time, you know, from the very beginning, then look at areas where is the highest risk of loss. So if there's one area that really isn't under any pressure, there's not as much need to protect it today as there is in another area that has equally high benefits. And the third element to consider also is the opportunity costs. So if you have areas that are equally high biodiversity benefits, equal, you know, threat in terms of pressures, etc. But again, one is less costly to implement. And again, if you're limited on resources, that you should start with that one. So high benefits, high risk of loss, lowest opportunity costs. And that sort of process can help you sequence based on your budget and based on threats as well, how to go about locating protected areas. Obviously, if you have the funds available to target all your high benefit ecosystems, then that's obviously a much better way to go. And one of the things that we looked at in that publication also is how to scale up finance for marine protected areas. Land rights is a crucial issue. It really helps to have clearly set out property rights, whether it's communal or otherwise, but really being able to provide the correct incentives for land managers to have long-term incentives rather than short-term incentives for use. It's an important prerequisite. And finally, with regard to your last question on the climate community, I believe that more and more so, the climate community and the biodiversity community are recognizing the extreme interlinkages between these two issues. Climate change is one of the most rapidly growing pressures on biodiversity. Forests are a huge solution for climate change, and there is a lot of work underway, including on nature-based solutions, working on issues such as reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation to try and target areas that are not only provide high climate carbon benefits, but then also based on this system of high biodiversity benefits, how you can target areas that have both high carbon and both high biodiversity benefits so that you can maximize the co-benefits.
Thank you, Katia. Now let me take some of the questions that we received from the people that is connected in the web. One from Al-Qayyam Meiji. How will the targets in the post-2020 framework tie in with the older global targets such as the 2030 Agenda and Paris Agreement?
Thank you very much, Al-Qayyam, for that question. I think through the international community on both those sides, there's a strong recognition that we should build on the Sustainable Development Goals that are already in place, and that the post-2020 framework is very well aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals as well, and moving on from that. One of the things to consider is that when you look today at the Sustainable Development Goal 14 and 15, which is on life underwater, and Sustainable Development Goal 15, which is on life on land, many of those two goals, SDG 14 and 15, the targets they're under, many of them come directly from the Aichi biodiversity targets. So nearly half of the SDG 14 and 15 targets will also expire in 2020 as a result. So it will be very interesting to see how the post-2020 biodiversity framework will influence also the Sustainable Development Goals 14 and 15.
We have another question from the room. Could you do your question, Anthony?
Hi, Anthony Cox from the Environment Directorate. Katia, you rightly identify the Aichi targets around marine and terrestrial protected areas as being one of the more successful of the targets. And a lot of countries have exceeded those targets. But to what extent are these paper parks? We're talking about the quantity of protected areas, not about the quality. What's the OECD doing to address that issue?
So one of the things that the OECD has done is, first of all, using global data sets, they've been able to distinguish between any potential double counting between the protected areas. And one of the steps that they plan to do very soon in future work is to go more in depth to look at the effectiveness of protected areas using data from satellite data, so that you can sort of do overlays of the protected areas and the types of land cover change over time, so that you can get a sense of what the level of protection is across the current protected areas. We do have very good data today on protected area coverage, and one of the things that really would be wonderful if we can prioritize in terms of collecting better data is on protected area effectiveness overall. So that's an important element, as is of course all the other targets, mainstreaming as well, and looking more closely at the types of responses that governments and the private sector are putting in place to address and reverse biodiversity loss.
Thank you, Katia. Well, another question from the web. Didier Bavin is asking, what's about the links with SDGs indicators, especially on the goals where biodiversity could be affected or impacted? Sustainable consumption and production, energy, infrastructure, industrializations.
Well, bonjour Didier. It's very nice to receive a question from you. I believe that as the current process in a sense has started as of Egypt, which was in November 2018. So there's very thorough and rich discussions going on now. And as I mentioned, I think there's consensus and recognition that the current indicators that we are using in the SDGs, whether it's on SDG 14 or 15, which really actually do need quite a bit more improvement, but also across the other ones, that wherever we can draw on indicators that are useful also for the post-2020 biodiversity framework, that we should certainly do so. There should be absolutely no duplication. Use what work is already underway that's helpful. Yeah. There's no need to reinvent the wheel, but we should be able to try and make progress in the areas where the greatest gaps.
Okay, another question from the room, please.
Walid Wuslati from the Environmental Directorate. So thank you, Katia, for that. Building indicators is very important. However, which is matter in my sense more is how these indicators are used. Beyond the fact that we can do international comparison, benchmarking, which is more important is how these indicators are used in the policy decision at different levels. But I'm thinking more about the national level when the government have to decide sometimes about infrastructure. Do we have from the ASHE period, ASHE indicators, any feedback how this indicators was used? And is it considered for the post-ASHE just to have a monitoring indicators to follow how indicators on biodiversity for state or for impact, whatever, in the policy decision?
Indicators are useful at many different policy levels. I mean, here in the case, we focused more on the national interplay and also the idea that if you have consistent and comparable data, you could aggregate them at the national level to be able to assess whether whatever the post-2020 biodiversity targets are, whether the cumulative national efforts might put us on track for these post-2020 targets. But yes, of course, indicators are useful at very many different levels. And depending on the level of disaggregation and how specific the data is, they can help to inform decision making across all levels. I mean, particularly today with the innovations we have had in satellite data, where you have pixels that are getting smaller and smaller, then the same data can be used at national level, at global level, at regional level, at local level, and can therefore help inform decision making across different areas.
Are they effectively used in decision making, or?
I think more so in some cases than in others. Yeah, it's not something that we've looked at specifically. We're focusing more on the global national interface. And I mean, as I mentioned, one of the issues at the moment is that we have the current set of targets, but countries are in a number of cases using very different data to monitor progress towards the same target. So from the international perspective, we end up with these red, yellow, green light systems of whether we're making progress or not. And hence it's difficult to say, oh, this is where we need to make more progress on this particular target or in this particular region. And that kind of data would also then help you to inform, like, oh, this is where we need to put more capacity building. This is where we need to channel more resources. So the more specific that the data and the indicators are, the more that it can help to build a strong evidence-based policy analysis, policy recommendations, and policy outcomes as well, hopefully, which will then reflect on better state and biodiversity.
Okay, Peter Orr sent us a question. How will the international community ensure the targets are appropriate for protecting and increasing biodiversity, considering the track record to date is so poor? What is the significant change expected?
Thank you very much, Peter Orr. I would say that's quite a difficult question to answer. I would say that there's a strong consensus on the need for more specific and measurable targets, which is, I think, a very, very good thing. And also, my impression is that through the international community, they're also trying to draw lessons from the models that have been put in place, for example, under climate change, where we have the 1.5 degrees Celsius global target, and then we have the nationally determined contributions, which you can add up to see whether the cumulative contributions from countries can add up to the 1.5. And then you can also see whether, if they don't add up, then there's a need to ratchet up over time. And I do know that in various circles, this is a concept that they're trying to use and to maybe introduce or consider how it can be adopted in the post-2020 biodiversity framework, where again, this issue of comparable and consistent data across countries for the indicators would help to be able to do that.
Okay, do we have another question in the room? Yes, please.
So many thanks, Katia. I'm Alexander Dimitropoulos, also from the OECD Environment Directorate. So I was also wondering, in developing, like the post-2020 targets, so do you see a different role for economics and economists for what you saw, for example, the development of in the procedure leading to the 80 targets? So do you see, for example, more interest in sound, cost-benefit analysis, for example, like having a better idea of the costs and the benefits that biodiversity brings, and like whether this is somehow taken into account, like in these targets, or are we talking mostly about targets which are, like really where economics essentially is not really playing a role, and there is no difference between what you see now and what you saw, for example, in the IT process?
So several at least, or a few of the current Aichi targets refer to the need to value biodiversity and to integrate the values of biodiversity in national decision making, which is, I think, a very good thing. There's also, I think, consensus around the fact that measures such as or building consensus, maybe measures such as GDP for valuing the national economy really don't reflect nearly at all the benefits that ecosystem services provide. There's already also in the Aichi biodiversity targets, I think, the need to integrate biodiversity into national accounting systems, etc. And these are things that are underway across a number of different organizations and initiatives that are underway to try and help do that. So you've seen national ecosystem assessments in the UK. France is, I think, nearly completed one now as well, a number of other countries. These are steps in the right direction. In terms of the actual targets, I'm not sure to what extent that they would be influenced by cost-benefit analysis decision making. It's also quite difficult to do that at the aggregate sense for a number of the Aichi targets. It has been done for protected areas where there have been cost-benefit analyses to look at what might be the right level of protection and what are the costs and benefits of that level of protection. And just one example in the context of marine protected areas, one of the few global studies that has been undertaken on that shows that the benefits of increasing protected area of marine protected areas would significantly outweigh the costs. So if we had a higher, instead of 10%, if we had it up to, I think, even 30%, that even at that level, the economic benefits looking across the ecosystem services would outweigh the costs of putting those in place.
Okay, another questions from the audience in the internet. Odile Conchu is asking, many organizations are asking for one apex indicator as for the climate. What is your opinion? Feasible, realistic, or impossible regarding the complexity of biodiversity?
Thank you very much, Odile Conchu, for that question. I will speak on my own personal behalf, if that's all right at the moment. With regard to that question, I do believe that one single apex indicator for biodiversity would be very, very difficult to do. And I think it would combine so many different issues that it would turn into a bit of a black box. And I'm not sure to what extent that would be very helpful. However, if we were able to have maybe 5 or 6 apex indicators covering different elements, so terrestrial ecosystems, marine ecosystems, genetic resources, etc., I think that would be very helpful. And I mean, there is already work underway on these issues, scientific articles by Georgina Mace and others who have proposed different types of indices, such as on the Living Planet Index, etc., that could be very, very helpful in this regard. It's not something that we've worked on so far in our OECD ongoing current work, nor that we discussed at our workshop. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, final questions from the audience in internet too. Who should be in charge of measurement, reporting, or verification, MRV? Who should or could pay for the system?
Sorry. In terms of measuring and reporting, I mean, normally the responsibility is for governments to monitor and report through their national reports on the different indicators.
Satellite indicator.
There's also the satellite indicator data, where it's generally research institutions that have that kind of information, or through also international organizations where they collect data from across a range of countries, but then also do a verification process to make sure that the data is reported consistently across the country. So like a verification process before the information is just published outright. So I think that there's different ways that this could be set up, depending also on how the data is collected, how it's reported, etc. I do think that verification is very, very important. And again, there are examples in the climate change framework that could be a helpful model for perhaps how it's undertaken also in biodiversity, where there's also peer review and yeah, generally peer review of data, etc.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Katia. We are finishing this session regarding biodiversity framework post-2020, enhancing measurability to track progress at global and national level. Thank you very much for participating in this event, and thank you to Katia Kurosaki, who made Karasuki. Sorry, Katia.
It's okay.
No, but thank you very much indeed for the explanation. You made a splendid presentation of the work that we are doing at the OECD environment. Thank you very much.